Okay, let's unpack this. Um, Imagine a real crucible of ancient civilizations, right? Where empires are constantly clashing, shifting like sand. And you've got these vital trade routes converging like arteries, really. And smack in the middle of all this incredible pressure, a unique identity gets forged, one that echoes, through millennia. Today, we're diving deep into a truly fascinating and foundational period of history, the era of ancient Israel. Specifically, we're looking at its kingdoms, its conflicts, and its enduring heritage. You provided us with these incredibly rich excerpts from ancient Israel, kingdoms, conflicts, and heritage. And our mission here, for this deep dive, is to really extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from them, sort of give you that shortcut to being truly well-informed about this really pivotal historical narrative.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here and what this source material lays out so well, it's not just a simple timeline, a chronological journey. It's this complex interplay. It consistently connects the political events, the rise and fall of kings, the clash of armies, with these really profound social, religious, and cultural transformations that are happening at the same time. So we'll be exploring how this collection of, well, pretty disparate tribes managed to evolve into powerful, centralized kingdoms, how they faced these immense external pressures from, monumental empires, and ultimately how through periods of both, incredible glory and devastating loss, they left this indelible mark on history and faith that frankly continues to shape our world today.
That is a huge narrative. I'm already hooked. Okay, so by the end of this deep dive, you listening should have a really clear understanding of the key figures, the big names who shaped this era, also the major geopolitical forces that were constantly acting upon them, and those profound internal developments that truly forged ancient Israel. It's a chance to get that aha moment about one of the most studied and you could argue most influential periods of antiquity. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so to really appreciate the journey of ancient Israel, we first need to set the scene, right? Geographically and temporally. Our source paints this vivid picture of the late 2nd and early 1st millennia BCE in the Near East. What was this whole region like, particularly the area we now know as Palestine, Israel, Lebanon? What kind of environment were they emerging into?
Right. This was, as you said, a truly dynamic place and complex, almost like a geopolitical pressure cooker, really. You got a picture of vibrant but often volatile mosaic of different entities all crammed together. So you had numerous Canaanite city-states. Think of them as like self-governing urban centers, often fortified, right? Each with its own local government, its own economic interests, its own little sphere of influence. Kind of like independent mini-kingdoms, often squabbling or making temporary alliances with each other.
Okay, so lots of small players.
Exactly. But beyond these settled cities, the landscape was also home to diverse tribes, nomadic communities constantly moving across the land. They're interacting with the city-states, sometimes peacefully, through trade, sometimes through raids or conflict. It was very fluid social tapestry.
And the big empires.
Ah, yeah. Crucially, this wasn't just a local affair. Looming over this whole mosaic were the shadows of these rising, powerful empires. We're talking about the great powers of the time Egypt down to the southwest, the Hittites up north, though their influence was kind of waning by this period. And then later, there are really formidable Assyrians and Babylonians coming out of Mesopotamia. These giants were starting to expand their reach, constantly vying for control, for resources.
And this specific area was important. Why?
Because it was, unequivocally, a crossroads, a major hub for trade routes in the eastern Mediterranean. Imagine these vital overland routes connecting Egypt all the way to Mesopotamia, and then the sea routes linking the Phoenician coast to the whole Mediterranean world. This made the region a constant focus of political power struggles. It was the strategic corridor that every empire wanted a piece of. The source really emphasizes this period's movement and complexity. It wasn't static, ever. Always evolving, always contested. This geographical centrality meant it was perpetually desired by bigger powers, and that played a huge role in the dramatic history we're about to get into.
That paints a really clear picture. It's like a small, developing group of people trying to find their footing in a really big, dangerous neighborhood. And within this bustling, often volatile landscape, the Israelite people start their historical journey.
The source describes their progression, right? From just residing in Canaan to actually achieving political unity. Can you walk us through that whole arc?
Absolutely. The source highlights a fascinating and often pretty tumultuous arc for the Israelite people. They start out as this confederation of tribes. Their initial settlement in Canaan seems pretty decentralized, loosely bound by maybe shared traditions and some common religious understanding. From that state, they transitioned into a unified kingdom under a single monarch.
Yeah.
But that unity, as we'll definitely get into, was incredibly hard-won, and ultimately it proved quite fragile. That led to this dramatic split into northern and southern kingdoms, each with its own capital, its own political struggles, its own destiny, really.
Wow. Okay, so unity then division. Right. And from that point on, both of these kingdoms faced constant and increasing pressure from those regional superpowers we just mentioned, particularly the Assyrians and then the Babylonians. They were relentless. And amidst all this political and military turmoil, I mean, these were existential threats, there were these significant internal religious and cultural transformations happening. These developments were profoundly shaped by, and in turn, shaped the external events. The very identity of the Israelite people was being forged in this crucible of external pressure and internal reform. And ultimately, this whole grand narrative culminates in a devastating period of exile when the last remaining kingdom falls. So yeah, it's a grand sweeping story of rise, division, immense pressure, and actually remarkable resilience.
That is a truly comprehensive trajectory.
I know.
It does raise a pretty important question.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to piece together such an ancient history, so complex?
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about periods so far removed from us, where, direct historical accounts might be scarce or maybe biased.
That's a critical point, absolutely. And our source addresses it head on. It notes that the historical records from the very, very beginning of the Israelite journey are limited. And at times, the source even says they're mythological in dimension, which is crucial for understanding the challenges, right? We're not always dealing with dry, objective chronicles like a modern historian might hope for. Early accounts are often interwoven with religious narratives, with oral traditions. They reflect the beliefs and the collective memory of the people themselves. However, and this is key, the source stresses that archaeological findings and external historical sources are absolutely crucial. They help establish the chronological framework, and they corroborate many of the events described in, say, the biblical texts.
So it's like putting together a puzzle with different kinds of pieces.
Exactly. We're drawing from this rich, multi-layered body of evidence. Archaeologists are meticulously digging through layers of earth, uncovering ancient cities, everyday objects, fortifications, even remnants of temples. That gives us tangible evidence of settlement patterns, technology, daily life. And then we rely heavily on external historical sources. Things like monumental inscriptions from neighboring empires, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, their administrative records. These documents often mention campaigns into the land of Israel, or they list kings of Israel and Judah as paying tribute. That provides independent verification and crucial chronological markers. So it's not just one type of record. It's this meticulous cross-referencing and critical analysis of various disciplines: archaeology, epigraphy, which is the study of inscriptions, comparative historical studies. You put it all together to build the most accurate picture possible of this distant past. It's truly detective work across millennia.
That context is incredibly helpful. Okay, let's zoom in now on a really pivotal era, the United Israelite Kingdom period, roughly, 1000 to 930 BCE. Our source tells us the Israelite people initially lived as these independent, decentralized tribes. What were these tribes? And what actually compelled them to unite, to leave behind that decentralized structure?
Yeah, the source specifically names the traditional 12 tribes, which formed the kind of foundational structure of early Israelite society. You've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Yehuda, or Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Initially, they were distinct entities, right? Each with its own territory, its own customs, its own leadership, operating in a largely decentralized way without a single overarching political authority. Their interactions were often governed by this tribal confederation, which was more like a loose alliance for mutual defense or maybe shared religious festivals rather than a strong central government. Think of them almost as individual family clans spread across the land, bound more by shared heritage and faith than by, say, a powerful capital city or a unified army.
So what changed? What pushed them towards unity?
Well, the catalyst was critical. It seems to have been this convergence of factors. Persistent political instability in the broader region, certainly. Growing economic difficulties, that likely made it harder for them to sustain themselves independently. But most significantly, escalating external threats. The source specifically points to these intense and repeated conflicts with the Philistines, the Sea Peoples. These guys were a formidable military presence down on the coastal plain, technologically advanced, using iron weapons, and they were a constant menace to the Israelite settlements further inland. They were encroaching on Israelite territory, posing a real existential threat. That, along with conflicts with other regional city-states, seems to have been the driving force behind this desperate need for a common centralized administration. It wasn't really an internal desire for unity just for unity's sake. It was more of an external necessity, a matter of collective survival against common, powerful enemies that compelled them to try and overcome their tribal distinctions and form a more cohesive political and military entity.
So it really was a crisis that pushed them together. And this context, as the source mentions, is key to understanding how the first kings emerged, right?
Precisely. This desperate situation really explains why the prophet Samuel's leadership, he was a hugely influential religious figure, and what's described in the text as a divine selection led to Saul being named Israel's first king. He wasn't chosen primarily for, say, his administrative genius or diplomatic skills. He was chosen to address a very real, pressing need for military and political cohesion, specifically against that Philistine threat. It was a moment where the existing tribal system just couldn't cope with the scale of the external dangers. It necessitated this dramatic shift towards a monarchy, something capable of marshaling collective resources, leading a unified defense, and commanding the allegiance of diverse tribes for a common purpose.
Okay, so King Saul takes the throne, marking this huge transition from tribal confederation to monarchy. What characterized his rule, and what specific challenges did he face in this, pioneering role?
Saul's reign, happening around the late 11th to early 10th century BCE, it represents this crucial, kind of nascent stage of Israelite monarchy. It's primarily remembered for his relentless wars with the Philistines. The source acknowledges his military capability in these conflicts. It highlights his essential role as this warrior king, called upon to lead the fledgling nation in battle against its most dangerous foe. And he did achieve some notable victories, pushing back against Philistine incursions.
But it wasn't smooth sailing.
Definitely not. His significant and ultimately maybe debilitating challenge was his inability to fully achieve durable tribal unification. Despite that initial push for a united front against external enemies, those deep-seated loyalties, the jealousies, the rivalries among the 12 tribes, they just persisted. Political authority remained pretty weak amongst the tribes. They weren't used to a strong central power, and his position was constantly debated, challenged. And critically, he also faced this constant struggle with Samuel's powerful religious authority. Remember, the prophet who had anointed Saul. He maintained immense spiritual influence and frequently challenged the king's decisions based on what he proclaimed as divine will. That led to severe tensions, and it undermined Saul's legitimacy in the eyes of many. The biblical account, as the source notes, even states he failed to fulfill God's will, which then paved the way for David's succession. Historically, this period just reflects the immense social and political complexity of trying to establish a true central government from a fragmented tribal society. Saul really struggled to bridge that gap between charismatic military leadership and the intricate art of governing a diverse, often fractious collection of tribes who were still very accustomed to a high degree of local autonomy. He was the prototype, facing all the initial growing pains of this new political system.
Yeah, sounds like a difficult, almost thankless task he had. So from Saul's struggles, we move to King David. Our source describes him as one of the most important figures in Israel's history. He reigns from about 1000 to 961 BCE. How did he manage to not only consolidate the kingdom, but actually transform it into a regional power? What were his key achievements?
David's journey is truly remarkable, especially given his, relatively humble origins. The source tells us he came from the tribe of Judah, which was relatively small and maybe somewhat marginalized at the time. He initially served in Saul's court, famously as a musician and armor-bearer. His rise to prominence was really propelled by his extraordinary military successes, particularly that legendary victory over the Philistine champion Goliath, which made him a national hero overnight. He then amassed a following, and after Saul's death, he gradually consolidated power, overcoming both the Philistine threats and the lingering remnants of Saul's supporters.
So he succeeded where Saul struggled, in uniting the tribes.
Yes, that was his most critical achievement. He successfully united the often fractious Israelite tribes and established a truly centralized kingdom. He didn't just win battles, he forged a cohesive nation, uniting the northern and southern factions under his charismatic leadership. And a brilliant strategic move, symbolic too, to cement this unity was his choice of Jerusalem as his capital. This city was deliberately chosen because it was neutral, right? It wasn't historically aligned with any one powerful tribal faction. Plus, its proximity to various ancient sacred sites made it a powerful religious draw for everyone. By conquering this Jebusite stronghold and making it his capital, David created this central hub for both secular governance and spiritual life, providing a shared identity and focus for all those diverse tribes.
And his foreign policy, you mentioned regional power.
Right. In foreign policy, David was exceptionally successful. Our material details his pretty comprehensive military campaigns against formidable neighbors, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Aram. These weren't just defensive moves, they were about expanding the kingdom's borders, establishing tributary states, securing its safety, and importantly, its economic stability. These victories elevated Israel from just a vulnerable collection of tribes to a significant regional power. They provided a buffer against future threats and allowed them to control key trade routes. Internally, the old tribal militias were transformed into a more professionalized standing army capable of sustained campaigns. The central administration was strengthened, moving beyond a loose tribal council to a more organized bureaucracy collecting taxes, managing royal lands. The economic structure also saw significant development, partly through tribute from conquered territories, partly through increased trade. This period really marks a true consolidation of power and resources, transforming Israel into a recognized, formidable kingdom on the regional stage.
Wow. So, military and political strength, but what about the religious and cultural side? The source mentions that too.
Absolutely. Beyond politics and military might, David's religious and cultural contributions were immense and had this profound, lasting impact. The source describes him as this unique figure who effectively merged prophecy and kingship. He placed himself at the heart of both state and religion. He wasn't just a political ruler, he was seen as divinely appointed, a man after God's own heart, intimately connected with the spiritual life of his people. This fusion established a model for later kingship, where religious piety and adherence to divine will were seen as integral to political legitimacy and success. And then there are the Psalms, many of which express profound spiritual longing, praise, lament, confession. They're intimately associated with his name, his genius. They form cornerstones of religious life and expression even today, reflecting a deep personal and national relationship with God. His unique covenantal relationship with God was fundamental in shaping Israel's national identity, emphasizing this idea of a chosen people bound by divine promise. This is where it gets really interesting how one figure could have such a multifaceted impact, laying not just political and military foundations, but also this deep spiritual and cultural bedrock for an entire people. He truly embodies that fusion of political and religious authority that would define Israel for centuries.
That is quite a legacy. Okay, and then we have King Solomon, David's son. He reigns from approximately 961 to 922 BCE. His rule is often seen as the peak, right? The absolute peak of the Israelite kingdom, the golden age. What truly defined this era of empire and wisdom, as the source calls it, and how did it reach such heights?
Solomon's reign, yeah, it was indeed the kingdom's most brilliant period, often characterized by unparalleled peace and prosperity, largely built on the foundations David laid with his military expansions. His foremost project, and arguably his defining legacy, was the monumental construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. This wasn't just any building, it became the central hub of Israelite religious life, the focal point for worship, for sacrifice, for pilgrimage. Our sources suggest it was an architectural marvel, built with imported cedar from Lebanon, adorned with gold, symbolizing immense wealth and power. It was a monumental achievement, both as an outward display of power and wealth, signaling Israel's prominence to its neighbors, and for internal religious integrity, centralizing and solidifying the worship of God for generations. It became this lasting, revered symbol in Jewish history.
And Solomon himself, wisdom and wealth.
Right. Solomon himself became synonymous with immense wealth and profound wisdom. The sources recount these tales of his legendary wisdom, his ability to judge complex disputes, his vast knowledge. Apparently, it attracted visitors from distant lands, like the famous Queen of Sheba. His administration was incredibly shrewd, controlling key trade routes, particularly those extending from the Red Sea up to the Mediterranean. This facilitated the movement of valuable goods, copper from Edom, horses from Cilicia. This strategic control of commerce generated immense income filling the royal coffers, and this wealth in turn fueled significant developments in art and architecture across the kingdom. New palaces built in Jerusalem, impressive fortified cities constructed at strategic points like Hazor, Megiddo, Bezer, new ports, new roads developed for trade. It was truly an era of unprecedented prosperity, grand projects, and international influence, really reflecting an empire at its zenith.
That sounds like a truly magnificent period.
Bye-bye.
But our source is careful to highlight that Solomon's glory also contained the seeds of its own destruction, right? What were these hidden costs of such grandeur? And how did they ultimately impact the kingdom?
That's a crucial observation, yeah. And the source is indeed careful to highlight that Solomon's era, despite all its brilliance, also brought significant economic and social challenges. There was this subtle but powerful undercurrent beneath the glittering facade of prosperity. The sheer scale was building projects, especially the temple and his elaborate palace complex, coupled with maintaining his lavish court and extensive trade networks. It necessitated incredibly high taxes on the populace. You can imagine the burden on ordinary farmers, on artisans who had to contribute to these massive state undertakings.
And the forced labor, too.
Exactly. He implemented a system of forced labor, the corvée, on a wide scale. This meant citizens were compelled to work for the state, often without pay, for months at a time on these grand construction projects. Now, these policies, while generating the wealth and infrastructure we just discussed, caused widespread and growing discontent among the people, especially, it seems, in the northern tribes who felt disproportionately affected by the levies and the labor demands. These economic and social burdens created significant cracks within the kingdom's internal structure. And crucially, these growing tensions and resentments served as the first undeniable signs of the kingdom's eventual dramatic division right after his death. So the very policies that marked his golden age also contained the seeds of its undoing. It highlights a classic historical paradox, doesn't it? That unchecked prosperity, if it's unevenly distributed and achieved through burdensome means, can indeed become a potent force for fragmentation rather than unification. And it seems in Solomon's case, the answer was a resounding yes. It led directly to the fracturing of that united kingdom.
So Solomon's grand reign ends, and boom, we see the kingdom dramatically split around 930 BCE. Our source points to those economic burdens, combined with political intrigues and these long-standing tribal rivalries. How did this division actually happen? What were the immediate results?
Right. The source clearly states that following Solomon's death, the unified kingdom just fractured into two distinct entities, an event known as the Schism. 10 of the tribes, mostly those located in the northern and central highlands, broke away to form the northern kingdom. And interestingly, they kept the name Israel, which was a significant claim to continuity, wasn't it? Meanwhile, the two southern tribes, mainly Judah and Benjamin, remained loyal to the Davidic dynasty, Solomon's line, and formed the southern kingdom known simply as Judah.
And this wasn't just politics, it was deeper.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just some arbitrary political split. The underlying reasons were deep and complex. You had those significant economic inequalities that had festered under Solomon. The northern tribes really felt disproportionately burdened by his massive building projects, the heavy taxes, the forced labor. They felt exploited by this distant, centralized administration down in Jerusalem, the harshness of Solomon's centralized rule itself, which had kind of overridden traditional tribal autonomies and local customs. That also fueled resentment. And finally, there were those long-standing historical rivalries between the tribes themselves, particularly between the powerful northern tribes, often led by Ephraim, and the southern tribe of Judah, where David and Solomon came from. The northern tribes basically wanted more autonomy, a less centralized authority, maybe a return to something more like the earlier tribal confederation, which they saw as more equitable. In contrast, the tribe of Judah in the south was determined to maintain that centralized monarchy in Jerusalem. It had become their religious and political hub, the seat of the Davidic dynasty. So it wasn't just political. It was deeply ingrained cultural, economic, even ideological divergence that had been simmering, a clash between different visions for the nation's future. And ultimately, it led to two separate kingdoms, often at odds with each other, for centuries.
That makes perfect sense. Different interests, different grievances fueling the split. Okay, let's look at the northern kingdom of Israel first. It was the larger entity, right, by population and territory. What was its political and religious character after the split? What set it apart?
Right. Northern Israel, being the larger and more populous of the two, eventually established Samaria, or Shamron, as its capital, a strategically important city chosen for defensibility, central location. Politically, however, it was notoriously unstable, a real stark contrast to Judah's later dynastic continuity. The source mentions something like 20 to 25 kings ruling over a much shorter period than Judah had kings, and they often gained power through violent means, coups, assassinations. This indicates a high degree of internal turmoil, constant power struggles, a pervasive lack of established dynastic succession. Just this succession of short-lived rulers and an overall climate of uncertainty. Imagine a state constantly embroiled in internal conflicts like that. Makes you vulnerable, doesn't it?
Definitely. And religiously, how did it differ from Judah?
Religiously, it was a more heterogeneous society compared to Judah. There was no single official religious center like Jerusalem with its temple, which had become the sole legitimate place of worship for the southern kingdom. Instead, multiple temples and cult sites were established throughout the northern kingdom. Places like Bethel and Dan became important religious centers. And crucially, idol worship seems to have been quite prevalent, often blending with the traditional worship of God. This religious syncretism, the blending of different religious beliefs and practices, often incorporating elements of Baal worship or other Canaanite deities alongside the worship of God, that and the accompanying social injustices, led to these strong condemnations from a remarkable succession of prophets. Figures like Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea. They tirelessly spoke out against the syncretism, against the rampant idolatry, against the oppression of the poor, against the perceived societal corruption. They were trying to warn the people and the kingdom about their straying path, about the dire consequences of their actions. Amos, for instance, famously condemned the wealthy for selling the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. These prophetic voices were like a moral conscience in a kingdom really struggling with both political and spiritual integrity.
Okay, so in contrast to that turbulent north, the southern kingdom of Judah seems to have followed a different, maybe more stable trajectory. How did it differ from its northern counterpart, both politically and religiously?
Indeed, Judah presented a stark contrast in many ways.
Yeah.
It famously maintained Jerusalem as its capital, yeah. And the continued presence of the first temple there significantly increased its religious importance. The temple became the undisputed spiritual heartland of the kingdom. It provided this unifying religious and cultural force that the north really lacked. This centralization of worship, focusing on the temple as God's dwelling place, was a powerful factor in Judah's identity.
And politically more stable, too.
Much more stable, yes. Compared to the north, Judah experienced much greater political stability. While the north saw frequent, often violent dynastic changes, Judah maintained a pretty consistent dynastic succession rooted in the Davidic line. They traced their kings right back to King David himself. They had around 20 kings, similar number maybe, but over a much longer lifespan as a kingdom. That gave them continuity in governance. Prophetic activity was also very high here. You get these incredibly influential figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel emerging to guide the nation. But unlike the northern prophets who often seem to be condemning a departure from foundational principles, these southern prophets frequently called for religious reforms, advocating for social justice, urging the people to adhere strictly to their religious traditions and the covenant with God. They emphasized themes of obedience and faithfulness. Isaiah, for example, warned against putting trust in foreign alliances instead of God. Jeremiah consistently called for repentance in the face of impending doom. This relative stability in the South seems intrinsically linked to its consistent religious center in Jerusalem and the strong prophetic voices that guided it. They acted as both a moral compass and a call to repentance, reinforcing this unique sense of identity and divine purpose for Judah.
Right, but the story of these two kingdoms, it isn't just an internal one, is it? As we move into the 9th to 7th centuries BCE, this new formidable power rises that casts this immense shadow over the entire Near East, the Assyrian Empire. How did this superpower start to exert its overwhelming influence, particularly on the Israelite kingdoms?
Oh yeah, from the 9th century BCE onwards, Assyria truly emerged as the dominant military and political force in the region. They were relentless, highly organized, technologically advanced military machine, renowned for their brutal efficiency, their psychological warfare. Their armies were vast, equipped with iron weaponry, siege engines, cavalry. They were virtually unstoppable for most smaller kingdoms. The northern kingdom of Israel, being geographically closer to Assyria's expanding western frontier and strategically important, felt the brunt of this pressure directly and almost immediately.
So what did Assyrian influence look like? Was it just military campaigns?
Well, they conducted relentless military campaigns, yeah, not just to conquer, but often to instill fear, to demonstrate their overwhelming might. But they also systematically imposed heavy taxes and tributes on the kingdoms they didn't directly annex. They effectively brought regional kingdoms under their iron-fisted sphere of influence. They were this irresistible force, really. And the source highlights how northern Israel, partly because of its location, partly because of its internal instability, was under constant pressures from them. They were trying desperately to navigate a survival strategy, paying tribute, making alliances, but it ultimately proved futile. Minor kings in the region frequently switched allegiances or paid tribute in a desperate attempt to just avoid total destruction.
And despite those efforts, the northern kingdom of Israel eventually fell. Can you detail that devastating event and its profound impact, especially regarding the lost tribes?
Yeah, The climax of Assyrian expansion, as our source describes it, came in 722 BCE. After years of raids and punitive campaigns, the Assyrian kings Shalmaneser V and then Sargon II finally launched a full-scale assault. The northern kingdom of Israel was utterly destroyed. Its capital, Samaria, was besieged and captured after a long struggle. This wasn't just a defeat, it was an annihilation of the state itself. And Assyria adopted this brutal and effective policy of mass deportation. It was a hallmark of their imperial strategy. They forcibly exiled a significant portion of the Israelite population from their homeland, often the elite, the skilled craftsmen, the military leaders, and then they resettled other conquered peoples from elsewhere in the vast Assyrian Empire into the region. This was a deliberate strategy, designed to break national and tribal identities, prevent future rebellions, and integrate the conquered territory into the Assyrian imperial structure, essentially wiping the Israelite identity from the map of the north.
And that's where the lost tribes idea comes from.
Exactly. This event is the historical tragedy of the 10 lost tribes. These were the 10 northern tribes of Israel, whose fate after this deportation remains one of the enduring mysteries and theological questions in history. Were they fully assimilated into other cultures, losing their distinct identity? Did small groups migrate elsewhere? The sources we have, they just don't provide a definitive answer, which has led to centuries of speculation, various theories about their whereabouts. What is clear, however, is that this was a direct result of Assyrian imperial policy and a testament to their ruthless efficiency. The Kingdom of Israel simply ceased to exist. And this event profoundly shaped the identity and historical consciousness of the remaining southern kingdom of Judah. It cemented their sense of being the remnant of God's people.
Wow. So while northern Israel fell, Judah, that smaller southern kingdom, managed to survive, albeit under Assyria's menacing shadow. What was Judah's relationship with Assyria like? How did it affect them internally?
Well, southern Judah was indeed forced to acknowledge Assyria's immense undeniable power. They existed in this state of precarious vassalage for a long time. The source recounts a remarkable moment of defiance under King Hezekiah, late 8th century BCE. He bravely refused to pay tribute to Assyria, which led to a devastating siege of Jerusalem by the mighty Assyrian king Sennacherib. Assyrian records actually boast of trapping Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Yet, crucially, Jerusalem did not fall. This deliverance, often attributed to divine intervention in the religious texts, was probably also a testament to its strong defenses, maybe a well-supplied city, perhaps even a strategic shift in Assyrian priorities due to other pressures on their vast empire.
So after that close call,
After that dramatic near catastrophe, Judah largely vacillated, sometimes submitting, paying increasingly heavy tribute to ensure its survival. Other times, periods of open rebellion against Assyrian overlordship, usually when circumstances seem to allow for it, often fueled by kind of flimsy hopes of Egyptian support that rarely materialized effectively. But this period, despite the immense external pressure, also paradoxically saw a significant strengthening of religious reforms and prophetic movements within Judah. Prophets and religious leaders, seeing what happened to the north, seeing the Assyrian threat perhaps as a divine judgment, they worked diligently to root out idolatry, which they saw as a cause of their suffering, and to enforce social justice. They believed that strict adherence to their covenant with God was the key to their survival. It's a compelling example, isn't it? How an existential external threat can sometimes actually solidify internal identity and purpose, pushing a people to reaffirm and purify their core beliefs and traditions right in the face of annihilation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. A period of immense pressure, paradoxically strengthening their internal resolve. But, okay, the geopolitical space shifts again, right? 7th century BCE, Assyria weakens. Babylon then rises to prominence. How did this new power dynamic, this changing of the guard among empires, affect Judah?
Right. The source explains that the decline of Assyria created this power vacuum. And Babylon, under powerful leaders like Nabopolassar and then his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, rapidly became the strongest power in the Middle East. Especially after their decisive victory over Assyria and Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, Judah, still kind of reeling from Assyrian domination, found itself in a truly perilous position, caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place. They were navigating this complex and ultimately tragic foreign policy, desperately attempting to balance allegiances between the rising aggressive power of Babylon to the east and the declining, but still significant, might of Egypt to the southwest. Egypt occasionally offered these tantalizing but ultimately unreliable promises of support. It was basically a no-win scenario for a small kingdom caught between two titans, each vying for regional supremacy and each viewing Judah as just a strategic pawn in their larger geopolitical game. Any allegiance, or even perceived allegiance, to one power risked incurring the wrath of the other. Judah was trying to play this high-stakes diplomatic game it ultimately just could not win.
And within Judah itself, amidst these overwhelming external pressures, the source describes a period of intense political and social turmoil. What was happening internally? How did that contribute to their precarious state?
Indeed. Judah faced a period of extreme political instability internally, which just compounded the external pressures from Babylon and Egypt. Kings were short-lived, often installed or deposed through foreign intervention, sometimes by Babylon, sometimes by Egypt. This further eroded any sense of national sovereignty or internal cohesion. The economic hardship was severe, made worse by the constant demands for tribute from the dominant empires, which just drained their resources. The social fabric was also fraying under the strain.
And the prophets were still active.
Oh, yes. The source specifically highlights the tireless efforts of the prophet Jeremiah during this desperate time. He was this lone, persistent voice amidst the chaos. He repeatedly called on the people, and especially the leadership, to repent, return to God, urging them to mend their ways, adhere to the covenant. He warned them against misplaced trust in foreign alliances or false religious practices. He saw the impending doom from Babylon as a divine judgment for their societal and religious failings, a consequence of their disobedience. But tragically, his warnings just went unheeded. The leadership, the people, may be caught up in desperate political machinations, may be unwilling to believe the extent of the danger, or perhaps just too overwhelmed by their immediate circumstances. They failed to heed his dire prophecies. This tragic disconnect between the prophetic voice aiming to guide the nation morally and spiritually toward repentance and the practical, often short-sighted leadership of the kingdom, it profoundly foreshadowed the coming catastrophe. It's a powerful lesson, I think, in what happens when the moral compass of a society is ignored.
And so all these pressures, internal and external, they converge on Jerusalem. We arrive at that pivotal, devastating moment in 587 BCE. What happened to Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah in this ultimate catastrophe?
In 587 BCE, the ultimate catastrophe for the kingdom of Judah unfolded. Babylonian King Nebuchadnezzar II, after earlier punitive campaigns, unheeded warnings, he launched a final decisive siege of Jerusalem. The city, which had defied Assyria, finally fell, and it was utterly destroyed. Its formidable walls breached, its buildings razed to the ground, its inhabitants subjected to the horrors of conquest, and devastatingly, the First Temple, the one that had been the central hub of Israelite religious life for centuries, the crowning glory of Solomon's reign, the symbol of God's presence among his people, it was burned down.
Just unimaginable.
It was. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a profound cultural, religious, and psychological cataclysm. The destruction of the temple was an earth-shattering event for the Israelite people. It challenged their understanding of God's covenant, their place in the world. And then, to ensure no further rebellion, to consolidate his control, Nebuchadnezzar initiated a significant deportation, the final one. He exiled a large portion of the surviving population, the elite, the skilled craftsmen, the religious leaders, the influential citizens, deporting them to Babylon, integrating them into the vast Babylonian imperial structure. The source emphasizes that this event marks the definitive end of the kingdom of Judah as a sovereign entity, and it ushers in the exile period in Jewish history. It's a moment of profound loss, immense suffering, deep uncertainty. But paradoxically, this seemingly final defeat would also become a turning point that would profoundly reshape the future of the Israelite people and the very nature of their religious identity, setting the stage for their endurance through centuries of dispersion.
What a dramatic and, heartbreaking conclusion to the kingdom period. But throughout this whole turbulent history, our source consistently highlights the enduring, often central role of the prophets. What was their function, really, beyond just religious leadership, in shaping this society?
Right. The source emphasizes that during the Israelite kingdom's period, prophets were far more than just religious figures or, spiritual guides. They were powerful social critics, keenly observing and speaking out against the injustices, the moral failings within their society. They were ardent defenders of justice, consistently speaking out against the oppression of the poor, the corruption of the wealthy, the abuses of power by the ruling elite. In essence, they were the conscience of the people and the nation, a kind of divine voice holding both the leaders and the populace accountable.
Can you give some examples again?
Sure. Figures like Amos, who famously condemned economic exploitation, the selling of the poor into slavery, Isaiah, who spoke of judgment for social injustice but also offered visions of future hope and righteousness, and Jeremiah, who tirelessly warned of impending doom due to a lack of repentance and widespread corruption. These prophets delivered potent warnings against social inequalities, rampant idolatry, societal corruption. They were not afraid to challenge power, even the king's authority, and speak truth to the people, regardless of the personal cost to themselves. Often they faced persecution for it. This fearless advocacy for righteousness and justice reflects a deep moral underpinning within the society, even if their warnings were often sadly unheeded. They served as this divine voice, consistently calling the nation back to its covenantal obligations, not just religiously, but socially, ethically, politically as well, reminding them of the standards set by their God. And their words, well, they continue to resonate as calls for justice even today.
And this era also saw the profound work of compiling and systematizing foundational religious texts. Can you elaborate on the significance of, say, the Torah and the temple cult during this time, especially maybe in light of the destruction and exile?
Yeah, this period, particularly the later stages leading up to and including the exile, was absolutely crucial for the development and codification of Israelite religious identity and practices. The basic texts of the Torah, which encompass the core laws, the narratives of creation and covenant, instructions for living, they were compiled, edited, systematized during this time. This was a monumental intellectual and spiritual undertaking. It provided this comprehensive and authoritative framework for belief, practice, a guide for individual and communal living. It was an essential step in preserving their traditions, their history, their laws amidst all those external pressures and the existential threat of losing their land and temple.
So the text became even more important.
Exactly. And concurrently, the temple cult in Jerusalem, with its elaborate system of sacrifices, rituals, religious ceremonies performed by the priesthood, that became the fundamental cornerstone of national identity and faith while it stood. It was the singular, central place where the people could believe they truly connected with God through prescribed acts of worship, purification, atonement. Its grandeur, its centrality solidified its role. These twin developments, the codification of portable sacred texts that could be studied anywhere, and the establishment of a central physical cult in Jerusalem, were essential for preserving and transmitting their unique religious heritage across generations. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it profoundly shows how a people's sacred texts and central religious institutions often solidify and become even more vital during periods of intense challenge and disruption. They become the bedrock of their continued existence and identity, especially when a physical homeland is lost. The temple might have been destroyed, but the Torah could travel, ensuring the continuity of their faith.
That's a really powerful point. Okay, finally, let's look at the societal and economic structure. How did the Israelite society evolve during this period, particularly regarding that traditional tribal structure and the emergence of economic inequalities we touched on?
Right. Initially, when the Israelites settled in Canaan, the tribal structure was dominant. It played a critical role in maintaining social order, a sense of shared identity. Land ownership, inheritance rules, they were primarily based on tribal affiliations, designed to ensure a degree of equity and communal belonging among the various clans. It was, in theory at least, a more egalitarian system.
But that changed.
It did. The source clearly indicates a significant shift after Solomon's reign, marking a distinct departure from this earlier tribal egalitarianism. With the rise of the monarchy, the centralized administration, increased trade, those large-scale building projects, economic inequalities significantly increased. It led to a stratification of society that was much less pronounced in earlier periods. We see the rise of a distinct aristocratic class, often connected to the royal court, the military, or the temple establishment. They benefited greatly from the expanded trade routes, the royal enterprises. Alongside them, wealthy merchants emerged, accumulating significant fortunes through regional and international commerce. This concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few led to growing social tensions. Between the rich and the poor, the powerful and the marginalized, this is a common pattern, isn't it? Observed in many developing societies. As wealth concentrates, so do the seeds of internal friction, social injustice, potential unrest. It shows that even in that golden age of the United Monarchy, there were these underlying economic and social issues that contributed to the eventual division and the subsequent challenges faced by the Israelite kingdoms. The ideal of a unified, equitable tribal society gradually gave way to a more complex, stratified kingdom with its inherent social stresses, which the prophets, as we said, tirelessly condemn. #outro.
Wow. What a journey we've taken through the history of ancient Israel. We've really unpacked how these independent tribes surged in conflict, united under strong kings like David and Solomon, built a magnificent temple, reached a pinnacle of power and influence, only to then face that dramatic, irreversible split into two distinct kingdoms, north and south, each navigating its own turbulent path. And then, those relentless pressures from truly powerful empires like Assyria and Babylon, culminating in the devastating destruction of Jerusalem and the beginning of that traumatic exile.
Yeah, this deep dive truly shows us how this entire period was absolutely critical. Critical for shaping the Jewish people's national identity and the very foundations of the Jewish religion itself. The initial political unity achieved under David and Solomon, the dramatic divisions that followed, the traumatic exiles imposed by conquering empires, the internal religious reforms that sought to purify faith, the foundational writing and compilation of sacred texts like the Torah, the development of the temple cult as a central religious institution, and those powerful prophetic movements that fearlessly challenged and guided the people. These are all fundamental milestones in Jewish history. What's truly fascinating here is how it all comes together as this complex historical labyrinth, right? Where regional and international relations, evolving political ideology, economic realities, and deeply held religious thought constantly intersected and profoundly influenced one another, forging this unique heritage that, despite immense hardship, endures to this very day.
That's a powerful summary, and it leaves us with so much to consider. So what does this all mean for you as you reflect on this deep dive? Perhaps consider this. How do periods of immense external pressure and internal conflict, like those faced by ancient Israel, not just challenge a people, but paradoxically contribute to the crystallization and strengthening of their unique cultural and religious identity, even through exile and apparent defeat? How does adversity sometimes become the crucible for an identity that endures millennia? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into ancient Israel, kingdoms, conflicts, and heritage. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.